He didn't walk off stage, he didn't collapse under a spotlight, and he never said the words out loud. But somewhere between the roar of the crowds, the empty hotel rooms, and the pressure of being the voice that carried an entire generation, Steve Perry quietly broke. Most people think he simply took a break, or that he decided he'd had enough of fame, but behind one of Journey's biggest tours was a truth Perry kept hidden for years, that the very thing he loved, performing, had started to tear him apart from the inside. This is the story of the tour that didn't just exhaust him, it hollowed him, and even he didn't realize the damage until it was too late. Before we dive in, consider subscribing to RetroWaves, where the legends never fade and where every story reveals the heartbeat behind the music. In 1986, Steve Perry wasn't just the lead singer of Journey. He was the glue, the perfectionist, the one everyone looked to when things started slipping. The Raised on Radio era was supposed to be the band's brightest moment, polished, confident, unstoppable. But behind the scenes, Perry was fighting battles no one else could see. For the first time in his life, the dream that once lifted him was beginning to feel like a burden he could barely carry. And the moment the band stepped into the studio to begin the new album, Perry made a decision that would haunt him for years. Verified fact: during the Raised on Radio sessions, Steve Perry fired longtime members Ross Valerie and Steve Smith from the project. It wasn't personal, at least, not how he later explained it. Perry believed the band needed a tighter, more radio-ready rhythm section. The pressure to produce hit after hit weighed on him like a vice tightening with every album. But inside the band, that decision sent a shockwave. Friendships cracked, trust dissolved. And Perry, instead of feeling in control, suddenly felt isolated, the face of a band that was no longer a band. He carried that isolation like a secret, and when recording ended and the tour began, the fracture inside him only deepened. People forget how demanding Perry's vocals were, not technically, but emotionally. Every night demanded power, precision, and heart. Verified sources show Perry struggled with severe fatigue during this era. Not vocal damage, but exhaustion, the kind that seeps into your bones. Touring wasn't just performing, it was. Interviews, sound checks, rehearsals, travel. The pressure to be energetic, charismatic, invincible. Meanwhile, he was carrying the guilt of having fractured the band's original lineup, and there was something else weighing on him, something heavier than the workload, something personal. The Raised on Radio tour began during the worst year of Steve Perry's life. It's a verified fact that Perry's mother, Mary Quaresma, was dying during this period. She had always been his anchor, the woman who believed in him before anyone else did, and she was fading. Night after night, Perry walked on stage, smiled at screaming fans, and delivered every note like his career depended on it. But off stage, he was consumed by a fear he didn't know how to express. He didn't want her to die while he was on the road. Imagine holding that in. Imagine singing faithfully when your own life was falling apart. He wasn't just exhausted, he was grieving in real time, before the world even knew it. Perry pushed through every show. He pushed because Journey couldn't cancel. He pushed because the label expected success. He pushed because millions of fans were watching. But the emotional weight began to show. Crew members later recalled he seemed tense, withdrawn, often going straight to his room after shows. Verified accounts describe him as distant, tired, and carrying something heavy. The tour wasn't killing his voice, it was killing his spirit. He wasn't just performing, he was running from the one truth he didn't want to face. And every night on stage, the breaking point crept closer. There's a moment artists rarely talk about, the moment when the thing you love stops making you feel alive. For Perry, that moment came quietly. He didn't announce it. He didn't even understand it at first. But somewhere between the early shows and the long stretch of dates ahead, Perry realized something was wrong. Very wrong. He wasn't excited before shows. He wasn't relieved afterward. He wasn't feeling anything. Not joy, not pride, not connection. The spotlight felt cold. The applause felt distant. And the songs that once saved him now felt like they were consuming him. The man who once lived for the stage had started to feel like a stranger on it, and the biggest breaking point was still coming. It happened suddenly. One night, just before a show, Perry received a call from home. The news was simple, devastating, and the thing he'd feared from the beginning, his mother's condition, had taken a drastic turn. He had a choice: cancel the show, or walk on stage knowing she might not live long enough for him to come home. The pressure from the label, the expectations of the fans, the momentum of the tour, the guilt of breaking the band's original lineup, all of it collided into one unbearable moment, and Steve Perry made the decision that would change his life forever. He stepped on stage anyway, and that moment became the first crack that never healed. He walked on stage that night with a smile the world believed, and a heartbreak he couldn't speak. No one in the arena knew he had just made the most painful choice of his life. No one knew the guilt he carried in every note, and no one knew that this show, this single performance, was the moment Steve Perry realized the life he'd built was slipping out of his control. He had always been able to balance the demands of fame, but that night something inside him changed. Not dramatically, not loudly, but unmistakably. For the first time, he didn't want to be there, not because of the crowd, not because of the music, but because every moment on stage felt like a moment stolen from the person who mattered most. And after that show, the flood inside him only grew stronger. Verified accounts say Perry continued the tour, city after city, show after show. Fans saw the performer, the voice, the legend, but what they didn't see was the toll it took on him every time he walked off stage and reached for the nearest phone, terrified of what news might be waiting. He tried to hide it. He tried to stay professional. He tried to keep Journey moving forward, but he couldn't outrun the guilt of leaving home, the guilt of pushing the band harder than ever, the guilt of knowing the person who once whispered, "You're going to be something special," might not be there when he finally came home. And slowly, the tour that was supposed to define Journey's success started to feel like a cage. The emotional weight of the tour wasn't the only thing crushing him. Verified sources confirm that even after firing 2 core members, the tension didn't fade. It deepened. Perry, Neil Schon, and Jonathan Cain were carrying the group, but the chemistry that defined Journey in the early 80s, the brotherhood, the spark, the shared hunger, wasn't there anymore. The studio decisions, the business pressure, the strict schedules, everything was different now. Journey wasn't the scrappy, determined family it once was. It was a machine, and at the center of that machine was Steve Perry, exhausted, grieving, and expected to shine every night as if nothing had changed. The more the band succeeded, the emptier he felt. Crew members later remembered a small but telling shift. Perry stopped joking backstage. He kept to himself more. He stayed quiet during sound checks. He avoided after-show gatherings. The man who once loved connecting with fans suddenly slipped into the shadows the moment he left the stage. Verified accounts describe him as distant and tired, not from the singing. His voice was still powerful, but from something deeper. He was grieving privately, drowning quietly, and performing publicly. And the split between his public confidence and private pain began to widen, night after night, city after city, until one day he realized he couldn't outrun it anymore. In 1985, shortly after the height of the Raised on Radio era, Steve Perry's mother passed away. He didn't speak about it much. He didn't cry publicly. He didn't collapse on camera. He did what he always did. He kept moving, kept performing, kept giving more than he had. But losing her, the person who had pushed him toward greatness, left a wound he never fully healed from. Verified interviews later revealed that Perry tried to keep his emotions buried, believing that the show had to go on. But grief doesn't wait, and it doesn't stay quiet just because millions of fans are watching. Behind every glowing review, behind every sold-out show, he carried the quiet ache of someone who had lost his anchor at the worst possible time, and once the silence settled in, it never really left. When the Raised on Radio tour finally wrapped, the world thought Perry was at the top of his game. The band was still selling out arenas, his voice was still untouchable, the album was a success, but success is a strange thing. It can make you look unstoppable from the outside, even when you're falling apart on the inside. Verified timelines show that after the tour ended, Perry didn't rush back to the studio. He didn't plan a new album. He didn't announce new dates. He stepped back, quietly, slowly, without explanation. He didn't retire. He didn't quit the band. He didn't disappear completely. But something in him had shifted. The drive that once fueled him wasn't there anymore. The joy of being Steve Perry, Journey's frontman, had faded. Fans assumed he needed rest. Labels assumed he'd return stronger. Even his bandmates hoped the spark would come back. But what they didn't know was that the seed of his departure had already been planted, and the tour they celebrated was the one he would never recover from. In the months that followed, Perry became notoriously hard to reach. He withdrew from public life, he cut down interviews, he stopped initiating new projects, he drifted away from the spotlight that had once defined him. People assumed he was reflecting, or resting, or preparing something new. But behind the silence was a deeper truth. He no longer felt connected to the music he once lived for, and as the industry waited for his return, Steve Perry watched from the sidelines, quieter, more isolated, and more unsure than he'd ever been, because he knew something no one else knew yet. The next time Journey tried to move forward, he wouldn't be the same Steve Perry they remembered, and the entire band was about to collide with a moment that would change their future forever. Everyone assumed Steve Perry's silence meant he was catching his breath, but in reality, he was slipping further away from the place that once felt like home. The emotional wreckage from the Raised on Radio tour didn't fade when the concerts ended. If anything, it settled deeper. He had lost trust. He had lost joy. He had lost the sense of unity that once made Journey feel unstoppable. And whether fans realized it or not, the band was standing at the edge of something fragile, a moment that would shatter everything they thought was permanent. Because while the world waited for Journey's next chapter, Steve Perry wasn't sure he wanted one. Not anymore. Years passed and Journey went quiet. There were no new albums, no tours, no signs of movement. And then in 1994, something unexpected happened. Steve Perry released For the Love of Strange Medicine, his first solo album in a decade. Verified interviews show he didn't return to music because he felt healed. He returned because he was trying to feel something again. The album was reflective, nostalgic, emotional, a window into a man who felt disconnected from the world he once ruled. And surprisingly, it worked. The album found an audience. Fans showed up. His voice still soared. For the first time since that dark tour, Perry felt a spark, small, but real. But just as he began rebuilding himself, the past came knocking on the door he thought he'd closed forever. Journey wanted a reunion. In 1996, the classic members regrouped: Steve Perry, Neil Schon, Jonathan Cain, Ross Valerie, and Steve Smith, together again. The fans celebrated, the press erupted, the label prepared a massive comeback, and Perry, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Hope that the bond wasn't broken forever. Hope that music could heal what life had taken. Hope that Journey could still be a family. They recorded Trial by Fire, their first studio album together since Raised on Radio. And here's the verified truth: the chemistry came back, the sound came back, and for a moment, Perry believed he could come back too. He was older, wiser, calmer. The emotional storm of the 1980s had softened. He wasn't the same fragile man who walked through the Raised on Radio tour carrying grief like a secret weight. But then life, once again, delivered the kind of blow you can't prepare for. After Trial by Fire was completed, Journey began preparing for a world tour. The comeback was real, the excitement was massive, the momentum was undeniable, and then, a simple hike changed everything. Verified fact: Steve Perry injured his hip while hiking in Hawaii. Doctors told him he needed surgery, not eventually, but immediately. The rest of Journey wanted to keep the tour schedule. They wanted the comeback to move forward. They wanted momentum, but Perry was terrified, not of the surgery, but of being forced to choose again between the band and his own well-being. The last time he chose the band, he watched his mother slip away while he was on stage. He wasn't willing to make a choice like that ever again, so he asked for time. And the band, desperate after years of waiting, didn't want to give it. The discussions got tense, not yelling, not fighting, just the painful kind of tension that grows when people want different things but don't want to hurt each other. Journey wanted to tour. Perry wanted to heal. Journey wanted momentum. Perry wanted space. Journey wanted clarity. Perry wanted compassion. But the emotional scars from Raised on Radio hadn't vanished. They resurfaced, sharp, fresh, undeniable. Once again, he felt like the weight of the entire band was on his shoulders. Once again, he felt expected to sacrifice himself for the machine. Once again, performing felt less like art and more like obligation. And slowly, painfully, Perry began to accept a truth he never wanted to face. He didn't love the life of a rock star anymore. Not the travel, not the pressure, not the demands that always took more than they gave. And Journey, whether they meant to or not, were asking him to step into the same pattern that broke him a decade earlier. He couldn't do it again. Steve Perry did not officially quit Journey. That is a verified fact. What he did was nothing. He didn't schedule surgery. He didn't commit to a tour, he didn't push the band away, he didn't pull them closer, he simply remained silent. A silence that grew heavier by the day, a silence that brought Journey to a standstill, a silence that felt eerily familiar, because silence was how he coped after the Raised on Radio tour. Silence was how he learned to survive when the world expected too much. Silence was the only way he knew to protect himself from being broken all over again. And the band, after waiting months, made the hardest decision they'd ever made. They moved on without him, walked forward while he stood still, chose survival over sentiment, rebuilt the band without the voice that made them legends. And Steve Perry, the man the world believed had everything, felt something inside him quietly collapse, just as it had all those years ago. People asked why Perry didn't fight back, why he didn't step in, why he didn't reclaim the spotlight he owned. But the answer, according to verified interviews, is simple. He was tired. Tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. Tired in a way that came from decades of carrying more than one heart can hold. That tour in the 80s didn't just overwhelm him. It reshaped him. It made him question the very world he lived in. And by the time Journey pushed forward without him, Perry felt something he had never allowed himself to feel before. Relief. Because deep down, he knew the truth. If he tried to return, the same pressures, the same expectations, the same emotional storms would return with him. And this time, he wasn't sure he'd survive it. And so he stepped into a silence that would last for years, a silence that would define the rest of his career, and a silence that held one final revelation he kept buried until the world wasn't watching. His silence wasn't disappearance. It wasn't bitterness. It wasn't a rejection of music. It was protection. Because somewhere deep inside, Steve Perry knew that if he stepped back into the storm, he'd lose himself again, just like he had during the Raised on Radio tour, when grief and guilt and pressure swallowed him whole. And after Journey moved on without him, the world waited for an explosion, a tell-all interview, a dramatic statement, a fight, a reunion, anything. But Perry didn't fight. He didn't defend himself. He didn't defend them. He didn't even correct the rumors. He did something no one expected. He let go. He stepped into a life without obligations, without stadiums, without producers, without expectations, and only then did the truth become clear. He wasn't running from fame. He was healing from it. For years after leaving Journey, Steve Perry barely sang at all. Verified interviews confirm he avoided studios, avoided microphones, avoided anything that reminded him of the person the world wanted him to be. He didn't stop loving music. He simply couldn't carry what came with it. Because when he sang, he felt everything: the pressure of perfection, the memories of the tour that crushed him, the ghosts of the people he had lost, the weight of decisions he couldn't undo. And for the first time in his life, silence felt safer than applause. He spent his days living simply, driving, traveling, watching baseball games, taking walks, trying to feel human again. No recording sessions, no screaming crowds, no deadlines, just a man trying to find his own heartbeat after years of drowning in noise. Verified fact. Steve Perry has said in multiple interviews that he never intended to quit forever. He simply didn't want to return until he felt whole again. But wholeness isn't something fame easily gives back, and Perry's heart had taken too many hits. He watched members of Journey move on, rebuild, reinvent themselves. He watched the world embrace new singers. He watched the band he helped turn into legends continue without him, and for a long time, he didn't feel envy or anger or regret. He felt relief. He had made a promise to himself during the darkest hours of the Raised on Radio tour, a promise he never said out loud, but lived by. Never lose yourself again for the sake of a stage. He had lost too much already. He wasn't willing to lose what little peace he still had. And so the years passed, silent, steady, strangely gentle, until one day, fate, as it always does, stepped back into his life with a name he didn't expect. Her name was Kelly Nash. A psychologist, a fighter, a woman with a warmth that broke through walls Perry thought were permanent. Verified fact, Perry met her in 2011 while watching a TV documentary about cancer survivors. He saw her on the screen and felt something he hadn't felt in decades, a spark of connection. A friend introduced them. They talked, they bonded, they fell in love. But Kelly was already battling cancer. Perry knew their time might be short, and yet he stayed. He stayed because she reminded him of the parts of himself he had forgotten. She reminded him that life wasn't meant to be lived in silence. She reminded him that the world was still beautiful, even after everything he'd lost. Kelly Nash didn't bring him back to music. She brought him back to feeling. And when she passed away in 2012, after telling him to not go back into isolation, he faced the kind of grief that either destroys a person or pushes them towards something new. For Perry, it did both. In 2018, Steve Perry released Traces, his first new album in over 20 years. Verified fact, he made the album as a tribute to Kelly, and the moment the world heard his voice again, everything became clear. He hadn't quit music because he stopped loving it. He quit because he couldn't survive the life around it. His return wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, it wasn't a reunion with Journey, it was something far more intimate, a man making peace with the thing that once broke him. He didn't need stadiums, he didn't need world tours, he didn't need the spotlight, he only needed music, quietly, privately, on his terms. And for the first time since the Raised on Radio tour, he felt free. Fans kept hoping, the media kept asking, the industry kept speculating, but Steve Perry stayed firm. Not out of anger, not out of resentment, not out of pride, but because he finally understood the truth. The Raised on Radio tour tried to teach him he was never meant to be a machine, not a product, not a brand, not a voice that had to survive endless touring and endless pressure to be perfect every night. He was meant to be an artist, a soul, a storyteller, and joining Journey again would mean stepping back into the pressure that once crushed him, the pressure that took his mother from him, the pressure that stole his joy, the pressure that haunted him for decades. He couldn't go back, not and stay whole, and he wasn't willing to break again. So did a single tour make Steve Perry quit the music industry? Not exactly, but the Raised on Radio era, the grief, the guilt, the pressure, the isolation, was the turning point that changed everything after it. It didn't end his career overnight, it didn't push him into retirement instantly, but it planted the first crack, a crack that widened through loss, through exhaustion, through expectation, until silence became the only place he felt safe. Steve Perry didn't leave music because he stopped caring. He left because he cared too much, because every song dug into the deepest parts of him, because his heart wasn't built for the machinery of fame. And in that silence, that long, quiet, misunderstood silence, he finally found himself again. Not the rock star, not the legend, not the voice that defined a generation, just Steve, a man who survived what the world thought he loved. If this story moved you, there are more untold truths waiting. Subscribe to RetroWaves, where the music lives forever and the stories finally breathe.